Now for the final speaker for the proposition team, I call David from ACSI to conclude the case and summarize for the proposition.
It is interesting to note that at the beginning of in the early part of her speech, she stated that we cannot waste money on lots and lots of different groups of people, including the rich. And then at the last part of her speech, she says the rich people really, really matter. Clearly, the opposition does not have a clear idea of whether or not the rich people do matter in their case. Whatever it is, I'm not that concerned, because my primary interest group is importers and as the middle class. And I'll be telling you how. In this debate, both sides kind of agree with a few key things. And the question is, what's the best way to achieve those objectives? And so, let me go on to my three main points of contention. Firstly, I'll be talking about the affordability of the policy. Secondly, I'll be talking about the target groups. And lastly, I'll be talking a bit about what is the best way of going about it. So first, on to the idea of the affordability of the policy. Now, the last opposition speaker just talked about how, our budget is finite, we cannot spend it here, we cannot spend it there. Yet, it seems very clear to me that she has forgotten very basic macroeconomics, which is this. During times of recession, you run deficit financing. You are willing to spend beyond your means, so that when times get better and times are of plenty, then you can run a surplus and accrue reserves. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I put forth to you the idea that the reserves which Singapore currently has are A, substantial, and B, able to be used right here, right now. And so I tell you that during this time of recession, when people are suffering, when importers and the middle income are suffering, that it is this time that the government should make full use of the reserves that's accrued during times of plenty. Secondly, the idea that somehow if we lower GST now, it will not really boost spending because of the fact that, it's not really targeted, it's a very small amount, is really insignificant because of the fact that when GST is applied to such broad things as utilities, as everyday essentials, as fuel prices, then I tell you that to an everyday consumer, it actually amounts to quite a lot. And when there is the increase in disposable income, which can then be spent on other essentials, I tell you that this increase in spending across the broad section of society means that the economy can then be brought back under control, and that will actually be set back on the path to normalcy. Ladies and gentlemen, clearly she never actually listened to the elaboration of the extension which my first speaker clearly stated. So let's go on to the second contention, that on target groups. Now, I'm not sure why she kind of says that we have to decrease the corporate tax for importers and not worry about operating costs. Because the fact remains that for importers, we have, as my first speaker stated, two main concerns. That is our earnings and that is our consumer base. And we recognize that the best way to protect our consumer base is to actually cut GST on essential goods. She never really rebutted that. In fact, she never really talked about what is so bad about having lower GST for importers. Secondly, that on the rich, well, I've already stated the contradiction, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. And as for now, the sandwich class. Ladies and gentlemen, this notion has been bandied about in this debate so much that it's becoming very annoying because they forget one key issue. That the notion of class is something that is constantly in flux, due to the fact in a moment, sir, that there are salary cuts and that there are job cuts, that what we consider middle income now will in the very near future become the lower middle income and maybe even the poor at the very end. Yes, sir.
So tell me why I should place the interest of private companies such as importers over my very own people, because the GST cut will result in income tax increase.
Thank you, sir. You have not been listening to my first speaker. If you cut GST for the importers, that means importers do not need to raise prices on their imports, which means they do not need to raise prices and therefore protect the consumer base. So you see, if you help the importers, you help the consumers, and in the end it's a win-win situation for all. So, back to my point. That on the idea that the middle income is rapidly becoming the lower middle income and is constantly in flux. Therefore, the best bet is to protect the large section of society by giving them a big GST cut. So lastly, let me now sum up by talking about what is the best policy to pursue. Now, both sides agree that we have to boost spending. Both sides agree that people need to be able to afford to buy the essentials they need to live a dignified life. And both sides agree that the government has to spend some sort of money. The question then is this: where should the locus of control lie? shouldn't lie in the hands of the government and its bureaucracy and its manifold inefficiencies and administrative costs and so on by giving targeted assistance which will probably be hoarded and not be used anyway? Or should it be given to people so that they can choose what are the essential goods they want to buy, they need to buy, so that they are the people who can do better budgeting because they are the ones who know best about the increase in disposable income? I put forth to you the idea that at the end of the day, if you provide the consumers themselves with this control over their finances, so they do not need to rely on the government so much, but so they are the ones who are in control of their own spending because they know the prices of goods which have been reduced from GST, and that is the best solution of all.
And for the last speaker of this debate, of today, of this round, I call Benjamin from Raffles to conclude the case and to summarize for the opposition.
I laud the superb command of macroeconomic concepts on the part of the Anglo-Chinese School Independent. But what I must address, and this is very important, is that the very fact of the matter is their side stated that the Singapore economy is highly dependent on the import of goods. And so any argument which David Crawshaw on the side of the closing government stated that increased spending will result necessarily in a stimulation of Singapore's economy is false. Because the actual money that stays inside the Singapore's economy, bulk of it goes out of the country because most of it is going out to purchase imports. If you really want to stimulate the Singapore economy, you have to understand, no thank you sir, the makeup of the Singapore economy. And that makeup is that Singapore's economy is largely export driven. So, no, thank you sir, if you truly want to stimulate the economy, you either cut GST so severely that all the small fractions of money saved and re-entering into the Singapore economy through domestic consumption ultimately compounds into a larger sum, or you actually do something else, because we tell you that we'd rather you use this money for a different reason as opposed to cutting GST. Because we say, ladies and gentlemen, your cutting GST does not help. So on to my 3 points of contention and summary for today. First of all, on the extension raised by Anglo-Chinese School Independent on the closing opposition. Second of all, on the policy issues with regards to GST cuts and temporary GST cuts on essential goods. And third of all, on the idea of our extension and our defenses for our extension. So first of all, on the idea of the extension of Anglo-Chinese School Independent. Now, their side posits that because we help importers, by reducing GST, we will hence help consumers. Now, I have two things to say to that. First of all, their claim and their support for importers was completely unjustified in the sense they did not tell us, no thank you sir, why we should focus on the importers and why we should grant tax cuts to them. Granted, we say that yes, there is a GST, that GST will in theory decrease the cost of your goods that these importers sell to people. But we say that at this point in time, for the very fact of the matter that we are afraid of a deflation occurring in our own economy, is indicative that prices won't necessarily increase. In fact, they are more likely to decrease over time. So we say that what they say about how a GST cut will mean, no thank you sir, that prices will not be increased is utterly false. Now allow me then to move on to my second point of contention with regards to policy issues. Now, we say that, first of all, targeted assistance is a lot better because targeted assistance chooses who you want to help and chooses how much you want to help them by. A GST cut passed through Parliament will necessarily say in advance that we believe that a certain cut of 3.5% for a certain period of time will work. But there's absolutely no way that the government can change this policy, no thank you sir, in the course of its progress. Whereas if the government is allowed to collect the money in advance, then it is able then to budget later. It has greater leeway in deciding how the money can be used as opposed to employing in foresight. Furthermore, they say that your temporary GST cut on essential goods incurs nearly zero administrative costs. We say no. Can you imagine the administrative nightmare that the Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore will have to go through? No, thank you, sir. In order to evaluate whether when companies file their tax returns on GST, whether they are truly declared properly hold on a moment, sir, what indeed were essential goods, and they need to check then that these indeed were essential goods listed on the list, which is especially difficult since these goods have been sold anyway.
Do you think there's even more administrative hassle from your targeted assistance? And furthermore, it's as simple as decreasing a GST one day, and the next day GST is much lower.
So we say that your idea of a GST cut is a GST cut across the board. But because this motion states that we are only going to have a temporary GST cut on essential goods, that means IRAS will only cut 7% down to 3.5% for certain goods only. And as a result, it needs to make sure that when companies file their tax returns and don't pay up for this 3.5% of the goods, that they are paying up an appropriate amount, because they could just over-declare how much they can save, and then they choose to pay even less taxes to the Singapore government. Clearly, the IRAS and the comptroller would like to avoid this, and as a result, they would incur a great administrative cost. And lastly, now, let me go on then to defend my extension. Now, our extension states that we would like social assistance programs to be helped. Because when you cut GST, what happens in that situation is that social assistance programs will then be greatly burdened. And furthermore, when you cut GST, as our side has stated earlier, what happens in that situation is that it brings about a greater likelihood of an income tax increase that further punishes the rich even more. We say that this policy sets in precedence the morally outrageous policies that entail that whenever there's an economic crisis, we can necessarily tax the rich more, that they are the ones who will bear the blame and bear the brunt of every economic crisis we encounter. Furthermore, we say that deficit spending will not work because the Singapore government has maintained a positive budget surplus for so many years to come. It will be politically and economically untenable for anyone at all if there were if the Singapore government were to revert on this position and enter budget deficit. We say, ladies and gentlemen, for the simple fact that we've shown you how GST cuts don't help and how GST cuts in fact worsen the situation, we say go with the opposition.
We've now come to the end of today's debate, and the judges are going to leave the room to go up there to the back to deliberate.
I think this was a very interesting debate. It was on an extremely topical issue. All of us are probably going to go out immediately after today's debate and spend some GST and contribute to some people sending their children on scholarships in the future. It was very topical. I think the team that won in the end was the team that was able to draw the link best between the policy that is being currently debated and the exact effect that it would have on their interest group. It was the team that was able to actually convince the adjudicators that what they were proposing would have a direct effect, not only on their interest group, but also on the economy in general. That being said, we also thought that some of the teams could have been a bit more careful about some of the concessions that they were making and also the implications of the arguments when drawn out to their full conclusion. So, for instance, and this is the part of my adjudication brief which kind of gives away which side the debate went to, if on one hand you're going to say that a cut in GST is not a good idea because it also benefits the rich, then you shouldn't end up saying that a cut in GST might end up leading to an increase in income tax for the rich. Because that sounds to me like an ideal policy, right? You target decreasing taxes for the poor with a policy that ends up increasing taxes for the rich. So I think if you could think through those policy implications, that would have been a greater development of today's engagement. So congratulations to all the teams. I think you've clearly researched all the economic issues and are well on your way to becoming part of Ministry of Finance's next echelon. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Ro.
The winning team for this debate was the proposition second team.